Welcome to Crossroads. The Chinese Communist Party has been paying off key figures in the US to do the regime's bidding. And guess what? Well, recently declassified intelligence reports show the CCP was paying people, journalists as well, to push propaganda right here in the US. We'll be talking about details. Speaking of the CCP, the regime is also baking replicas of American ships and military bases for its troops to use as target practice. Why are they doing it? We'll talk about that too. And also, President Trump is now accusing European leaders of using fines as a way to rob the United States. We'll be talking about these topics a lot more today. So make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment. Let's get started. Now, I want to start off with some breaking news. A couple big things happened yesterday and the day before. Biden's ghostwriter tapes were released. Long story short, President Joe Biden got a ghostwriter talking about his writing his book, of course, about talking about his former, his deceased son. Very sad story. But they tried blocking these tapes from going public. Now, the early suspicions were because, the tapes would show that Biden had maybe, memory issues, health problems that were not disclosed. And that was kind of the big expectation with these. There were some examples of that in these tapes. They were not the biggest focus. It seems that at the time these tapes came out, this was prior to the 2020 elections, Biden's memory was not that bad. I mean, it was there a little bit, but it wasn't that bad. What is significant is he frequently talks about classified documents. And so that is the biggest part coming out with this. He says, basically, I got all these classified documents from my basement, and he refers a lot to classified documents used in this book and, in this whole process. And he talks about taking documents and so on. Why does this matter? It matters in one point because, remember Trump was raided, the raid on Mar-a-Lago, over a search for classified documents. The Biden Department of Justice appointed a special counsel, former special counsel Jack Smith, who might be indicted pretty soon. They're talking about it. Special charges were actually recommended by Congress already. So there are charges recommended against former special counsel Jack Smith as we speak. The raid on Mar-a-Lago took place over allegations that Trump had classified documents. Now, there's a big difference between Trump and Biden. Trump had classified documents, but as the former president, he had broad declassification rights. Basically, a president can speak it into the ether and say, I declassify said document, and the document is now declassified. The documents from Biden were from before he was president. Now you could say, well, he was vice president. Vice president does not have those broad declassification rights. You could also say, well, he was in Congress. You don't have those rights. And so Biden admitted effectively committing what could be crimes in these documents. That's why it matters so much. Now, does that mean he's going to face criminal charges? Personally, I doubt it. But I do think what will come out from this is basically more of a narrative on the weaponization of justice. And already the Trump DOJ is framing these documents as additional evidence on the weaponization of justice. The raid on Mar-a-Lago, this politically motivated, that others had committed the same crime Trump was accused of, and nothing was done against them. And frankly, they did it worse because Trump was a former president at the time where the others were not. Something else came out also. Dr. Anthony Fauci, his pandemic-era diaries were released. Now, Senator Rand Paul has been very big on this, talking about this. Many people have accused Fauci of lying to Congress. He was pardoned by Biden, had a very sweeping pardon. You're not going to see criminal charges on that front. But what these documents are now showing, and what the big discussion is, really, right? The big discussion on Fauci is effectively that as the pandemic was spreading and he was talking about deaths in America and, thousands of deaths, he has diary entries talking about this. He had a lot of other notes to himself saying, I'm like the most famous man in the world right now. And he liked the clout. He liked the attention. I have two perspectives on this. On one side, I don't believe these are, and hear me out, okay? I don't believe these are incriminating as they're being framed as. My personal take is that Dr. Fauci legitimately believed he was saving people's lives. And so as the virus spread in the United States, he effectively was saving these, thinking, you know what, I was right, and my recommendations probably helped save lives. The counter to that, which is coming out now, and RFK Jr. is giving some pretty scathing statements on it, is that Fauci was covering things up. Effectively, when it came to Fauci being vaccinated, live on camera, he was not talking about the fact that he had actually contracted, COVID a few times, meaning the whole claim about, 100% safe and effective was not there. The biggest part was that when it came to the proximal origins paper on the origins of COVID, they had 12 scientists. 10 of the 12 believed that COVID came from a lab. Only 2 of them believed it didn't. And when they wrote the proximal origins paper, they effectively wrote off the idea it came from a lab as being a conspiracy theory. Now, the question is, if the majority overwhelmingly believed it came from a lab, but the public narrative was the opposite, why were we told that? And, when Fauci was going around talking publicly, saying that any idea that it came from a lab was, conspiracy theory and dangerous conspiracy theory, the big prevailing question now is why? Why did he say that? When obviously behind the scenes, we now know the discussions, and we know that the overwhelming opinion was the opposite of what was said publicly. I think this will need some answers. To that point, Fauci is being called to testify before Congress, and because he was giving a sweeping pardon, many have noted, and I believe this would be the case, we'll have to see how it plays out, he will not be allowed to plead the Fifth. Under the Constitution, you can plead the Fifth Amendment and say, look, I'm not legally held to testify against myself. I don't have to incriminate myself effectively. So you could say, I plead the Fifth, Your Honor, and you can avoid basically saying things you don't want to say. Because the risk of him incriminating himself is not there because he's been pardoned, he's not going to plead the Fifth. The other side is, though, you could argue that the nature of the sweeping pardon from Biden might not include everything. We'll see, because Biden did give a very sweeping pardon. So we'll have to see where it goes, but that is now happening. That being said, some other big things happening right now. The Chinese Communist Party spent $100 million to influence the United States. The Chinese Communist Party has been paying key figures in the United States to do its bidding. And recently declassified intelligence reports, they showed the regime was paying people to push propaganda, not just on China issues, but even pushing propaganda to undermine the image of the President of the United States, as well as the country as a whole. And they were trying to divide the United States, trying to push narratives favorable to the CCP, all kinds of crazy stuff. And guess what? New reports are giving more details on how these operations just might have been carried out. Fox News says this. President Donald Trump's address to the nation alleging Chinese interference in American elections last week has renewed interest in Beijing's broader influence efforts in the United States. It says this: private entities based in China and Hong Kong. CCP took over Hong Kong as part of China, many of which have significant ties to the Chinese Communist Party, spend significant amounts of money attempting to influence America. And by the way, in China, you don't do foreign investment or big projects involving a lot of money without the CCP's approval. It just doesn't happen. It says this: the DOJ recorded over $20 million in FARA expenditures. That's the Foreign Agent Registration Act. In other words, if you're acting as an agent of a foreign government, you need to register under FARA, F-A-R-A. And it turns out a lot of that was happening from China. It says they had these FARA expenditures from these entities in 2025, with millions of dollars more being recorded in lobbying disclosures filed with Congress. So many registered as foreign agents, and a lot of them lobbying our government for government policy on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. It says Chinese government sources over the same period spent close to $80 million on FARA expenses. Now, no, it's not every Chinese influence operation happens on the books, however. Campus groups that the State Department has linked to the Chinese government, such as you heard it here first, the Chinese Student and Scholar Association, which is, by the way, funded and operated by the Chinese consulates and run through a branch of the Chinese Communist Party and operated in almost every major university in the United States. It says they do not file paperwork with the DOJ, leaving Americans in the dark regarding their operations. It adds, additionally, any groups that fall under China's United Front Work Department, heard it here first, a global network of CCP loyalists that work to advance Beijing's interests abroad, don't file disclosures owing to their clandestine nature. By the way, Jamestown Foundation found there are over 1,000 United Front organizations operating in the United States. Just of what's known, many of the United Front little proxies, many of them say they have thousands of members. Some claim to have tens of thousands of members. Some claim even more than that. You have a lot of Chinese spies in America. And what they do is try to, quote unquote, capture civil society. Capture civil society, meaning journalists, politicians, investors, business leaders, Hollywood, any kind of person of influence, and scientists. They try to capture them, and they think if we can capture them, we control the country. The CCP, think about it, has tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of spies trying to compromise every person of influence in the United States and other countries too. Let that sink in. And that being said, we're also getting some details on journalists, people working for the media, attending paid events from the Chinese Communist Party, and then we're seeing evidence of these journalists running pro-CCP narratives right afterwards. Now, War Room White House correspondent Natalie Winters has been doing some fantastic reporting on this, and she even names many of these journalists on their payroll by name. Now, she wrote a big Substack piece, but let me show you what she said on X. She said, quote, I exclusively uncovered the identities of prominent U.S. journalists flown to China by a CCP-linked influence operation. By the way, this operation is registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, meaning it is, without a doubt, a CCP operation. And the details of this come from their FARA disclosures, meaning this isn't some rumor, this isn't some random thing. I should note the Epoch Times actually did our own investigations into this, and what she says here corroborates our own findings. This is not secret, this is public, but people don't look at that usually. She says this is a CCP-linked influence operation seeking, quote, favorable coverage and, quote, positive messages about Beijing. In other words, other media are acting as literal agents of the Chinese Communist Party, pushing CCP propaganda. It says this, Trip organizers, CUSEF, which was founded, she says, by Teng Chihua, a former senior official in the CCP's United Front system. The organization is based out of Hong Kong, but the guy actually has an official title with the Chinese Communist Party. And the organization he's with is also tied directly to the United Front, meaning this is, and they're registered as foreign agents. It's public, right? She says the influence apparatus Beijing uses to cultivate foreign elites and shape institutions outside China. She says a bipartisan congressional report says the United Front works to co-opt and neutralize sources of potential opposition to the CCP, like journalists. It says American media was not incidental to the strategy. It was a target. And she says this, access went far beyond conference rooms. In other words, these journalists go to China, they get the, 5-star tour, they get fancy hotels and paid meals, and they work, there, and they get basically accommodated by the Chinese Communist Party. They meet with government officials, they get the whole Potemkin village treatment, they get to go to Xinjiang, where we know there's slave labor and genocide taking place, and they get to see all the pretty lights and fancy food, and they say, there's no genocide in Xinjiang, it's such a wonderful place. They don't take them to like the re-education camps or things like that. And these journalists eat out of the CCP's hand and say, wow, what a great thing this is. Now it notes this. She says the access went far beyond conference rooms. American journalists were taken on curated tours through China, including visits to Chinese military bases, by the same network seeking favorable coverage. So while the CCP is doing this whole thing, trying to cultivate like agents within the United States, it's publicly stating the purpose of these trips is to change the way that journalists cover China. And then guess what? As Natalie says, then came the coverage. Not going to name people by name, but basically it's most of the major left-wing media and most of the major establishment media. It's all the legacy outlets. It's New York Times. It's a whole bunch of them. And so they all have these journalists going to China, and then right afterwards, Natalie actually does a fantastic job showing their stories. You see these journalists begin carrying water for the CCP. You actually see their coverage just turn into straight up propaganda about China. It's insane. That was happening. Now, we don't know if that's the full extent of it. I don't think it is by any means. But this is something we can look at and say without a doubt, foreign agent registration, trips to China, tied in with the Chinese overt spy department, the United Front, and journalists working with the CCP on this. It's insane. In the chat, Andre M, you're saying the hypocrisy of China. Could you imagine if we did this to them? Shut the entire operation down. Yeah, imagine if the United States set up over 1,000 American friendship organizations in China and then went around China trying to cultivate ties with all their journalists, all their government leaders, all their business leaders, all their key people in academics, and then invited them to the US with the intent of altering Chinese policy and Chinese coverage on the United States. Do you think the CCP would let that stand? The answer is no. They would kill every person involved with that. They would execute them, they would call them spies, it'd be over in a day. We let the CCP do it here. Not only do we let them do it here, but we let the people working for the CCP get away with it. We let the journalists get away with it. We let the government officials, but some have been arrested. We let the government officials working with the CCP get away with it. We let business leaders working with the CCP lobbying our government to change political policy in favor of China get away with it, and we let it happen. We let academics get away with it. We let researchers steal our research and go back to China and get away with it. We let them do it. Why do we let them do it? I don't know. Speaking of the Chinese Communist Party, though, I don't know, maybe the paid journalists, when they went to the military bases, got to see this too. I don't think they did, but maybe they did. The Chinese Communist Party is making replicas of American warships in military bases in China, and they're using them for target practice. Let me show you this. A Business Insider says this: China is not just building replicas of U.S. warships. Satellite images analyzed by The Telegraph, and remember the Axel Springer Global Reporters Network that includes Business Insider, reveals it is also building models of fighter jets, naval bases, and Taiwanese presidential buildings. It says Beijing has been using these models to test its ever-growing stockpile of long-range weapons and new AI systems as it prepares to take control of Taiwan, a top priority of Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. It says the accuracy of the replicas, quote, signals a highly specific focus on potential adversaries rather than generic capability building, says Damian Simon, a geointelligence researcher at the AI analysis firm, the Intel Lab, who first identified several of the maritime models. Now, briefly on this, right? This is twofold. First of all, one side of this is for internal propaganda for the Chinese military. And what it signals is basically they're telling the Chinese military, our goal is to defeat America, our goal is to take Taiwan. And so they're propagandizing their own military to be like, we're going to fight Taiwan today. Briefly on this, the way this has been discovered is satellite images. There are a lot of researchers who go on different satellite image websites and they look at China and they try to spot things that maybe China doesn't want getting out. And people are looking in like the desert and around Chinese military bases, and they find, new warship developments. They find weird buildings, and then they start looking into it. And that's where you get these kinds of reporting. It's an interesting field of research. Years back, there were stories going around that the Chinese Communist Party had built a replica of the Taiwanese presidential palace. And they were staging like attacks on it, right? They were, practicing basically for a takeover of Taiwan and how to fight the president of Taiwan. My personal opinion, if they wanted to take that seriously, they should prepare for the Saving Private Ryan times 1,000 raid across the Taiwan Strait, fighting, drones and rockets and everything else. Basically being prepared to wipe out the majority of their military before they make landing, which maybe they don't tell that to their soldiers, but that's the reality of what that would look like. They're practicing for like raids on the presidential palace. They're practicing for things like that. It's propaganda, right? It's propaganda. You could argue that maybe a special forces raid does require such a thing like that. Other countries will do things like that for like special operations forces. Building a replica of a U.S. warship or a military base is a bit different, though. What they're doing is using these for like rocket tests and like missile targets. You could actually say it would be easier and less expensive to just build like a little target and say, hit that target. The idea of building like a replica U.S. warship there's no purpose to it. There's no actual purpose to it. Most militaries would take, derelict old equipment and maybe use that for target practice. The CCP taking time to like build replica US stuff, there's no purpose other than propaganda, right? They're just doing it for their own internal propaganda. On the other side of it, though, this is sending an external message, right? This is not just for internal messaging, it's for external messaging. So they're making it clear to the United States they regard us as their top enemy. They're regarding us as the person they're going to be fighting. And they're making this clear by saying we are practicing to fight you specifically. Now, I should note, from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, right now as we speak, the Chinese Communist Party has had a policy that the goal of the CCP is to destroy the United States. They've never changed that policy. Every major leader of the Chinese Communist Party has maintained the policy of destroying the United States. Even including like the reform and opening up period during like Deng Xiaoping. This has always been their policy, and it's insane that this is not talked about more broadly, frankly. This is a clear example of them even making a public statement and a public image saying, look, we are going to use our military to fight you. We are practicing to destroy you. And on the other side, you say, well, we're also going to pay your businesses to lobby your government to alter government policy. And we're going to pay your journalists to run propaganda for the CCP while pretending to be, unbiased media outlets. This is what's happening in the United States. This is what's been happening. Paid people covering it up, paid people pushing to alter our government policies and change our laws, paid people working on behalf of the CCP, trying to cover up even reporting like this, and then telling people they're our friends, while even publicly the CCP is stating that their goal is to destroy us. Let that sink in, okay? Wild stuff been happening in the United States, and wild stuff been happening for a very, very, very long time. Now, that being said, in the chat, Acoustic Kitty, you're saying if they're doing this under FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, imagine what they're doing in the dark. Yeah, right? And I think you make an important point here. If we know that the CCP, under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, has 20 million public operations under just FARA, millions upon millions upon millions, up to like 80, 100 million different estimates on it just in 2025, working to like change government policy and working through proxies. That does not include the United Front, that does not include the Chinese Student and Scholar Association, doesn't even include things we don't even know about. If you were to take my estimate on it, the scale of it would be just off the charts. It would be insane. Because again, if we can understand that what is publicly disclosed, Foreign Agent Registration Act, is just the stuff they're registering, just the stuff they're going through direct channels for. And we know the majority of the work is taking place through 1,000, at least, known front organizations. And these front organizations, many of which report to have thousands, even tens of thousands. I know I've researched them. There's like some in Canada that claim they have over 100,000 members. there's a bit of nuance to it because I know that they inflate their numbers because they're trying to get clout with the CCP. So let's say thousands or tens of thousands, even though their own reporting will say hundreds of thousands. That's a lot of people. And if you have 1,000, let's go by a low estimate, agents of the CCP working as a full-time job to impact our government, that's a big deal. That's a big deal, let alone tens of thousands, let alone even more than that. I should add to this also, the Chinese government has a branch entirely dedicated to political warfare. The former name of it was the General Political Department. It's with the Chinese military. And the General Political Department works on, they've changed the name since, Xi Jinping, he's been reorganizing the military a lot. I can't remember the new name for it, but you can actually find some very, very, very good reporting from people analyzing the operations of the General Political Department. This is a military operation, full-time, dedicated to altering the political structures of other countries. When Trump's talking about them attacking our elections, General Political Department. Again, they have a new name for it. We can find it online. It's not hard. The General Political Department on the military side works with the United Front on the government side. And so it's a dual kind of nature thing. It is military, it is government, it is intelligence, and they work through a lot of business networks also. So they take advantage of all these like avenues of contact. So if we engage with China on foreign investment, they use that as a two-way street for espionage and warfare. If we engage with them politically or sister city programs, it's a two-way street. We're going there, they're coming back, and they're weaponizing it as a form of warfare. They regard every one of these channels, every band we establish to link up with China, they regard that as a warfare domain. That is kind of a simple way of understanding how the United Front works and how the political warfare operations of the CCP work. It's shocking stuff. The craziest thing, it's been known for a long time, and almost nothing has been done about it. It's changing a little bit now. And I think Trump coming out and calling them out for trying to alter our elections, maybe that's the crossing of the Rubicon. But for a long time, nothing has been done to stop this. And it's just pervasive. The number of business leaders, investors, the number of journalists working at least on behalf of the CCP to some regard is just sickening and shocking. It's on a large scale. I could name a lot of people by name. I'm not that kind of guy. We'll let it happen naturally. I know some of the major financial investors and people like, carrying water for the CCP. I know one guy big in the libertarian movement who works as a spokesperson for Huawei, which has been deemed a Chinese military connected company. Let that sink in, okay? One of the big speakers about like China-US policy works for Huawei. On another topic, there are some big political shifts taking place in Latin America. In fact, the whole region's kind of changing right now. And guess what? Brazil is back on the table, and a Bolsonaro is coming back. Not the former Bolsonaro who's been in prison, but one of his sons. Daily Mail says this. Brazil's right-wing Liberal Party on Saturday formally nominated Flavio Bolsonaro, a 45-year-old senator and son of imprisoned ex-president Jair Bolsonaro, as its candidate in the October presidential election. He is set to face off against leftist incumbent Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a 80-year-old who is seeking a fourth non-consecutive term and has gained momentum in recent weeks as the younger Bolsonaro faced a series of crises because the government is attacking the Bolsonaro family. It says this, far-right firebrand, and this is media framing it because a lot of these media are incredibly biased. Far-right firebrand Jair Bolsonaro anointed his eldest son Flavio as his political heir after being sentenced to 27 years in prison, again Bolsonaro, for plotting a coup following his 2022 election loss to Lula. Briefly on this, Brazil basically replicated the Jan 6 model where you had government officials, holding the door open and letting protesters in. And it was like the lazy version of Jan 6. And there were very obvious examples of like local officials like working to basically frame the whole thing. But the same way they went after Trump on the Jan 6 narrative, they went after Jair Bolsonaro on the Brazilian version of the Jan 6 narrative, and threw him in prison for over 20 years. Now, my take on this, though, Bolsonaro's son is going to have a very strong shot at this. And we're going to very likely see a lot of attention from the United States on this election. Why is that? It's because Lula is one of the key figures who worked previously with Fidel Castro. They created the Foro ao Sao Paulo, the Forum of Sao Paulo, which, by the way, worked with Shining Path and the Sandinistas and other narco-terrorist organizations to facilitate the far-left takeover of all of Latin America. Almost, it was they call it the pink wave, late 90s, early 2000s. Lula was one of the masterminds of that, working with the Cubans. And what that effectively did was facilitated very far-left governments taking over Latin America, and then they pushed out the United States, and then they imported China, Russia, and Iran. So Lula was one of the key figures who facilitated that entire thing, working with Cuba. Lula was also in the Chinese Communist Party's writings. This goes back to Jin Canrong, I believe 2006. I can't remember the exact date. Lula was slated by the Chinese Communist Party as being one of their plans of starting a war in Latin America as part of their 5-war strategy to defeat the United States. They wanted Lula to start a war in Latin America that later shifted to Venezuela and Maduro, who's been arrested since, flying to New York to face trial. They wanted Maduro to start a war with Guyana, right? That was part of the 5-war plan of the CCP. They wanted a war in Russia. They wanted a war in Latin America. They wanted a war with a terrorist group. We got that with Iran. They wanted a destabilization efforts within the United States, mass protests, race movements. This is coming out now, and Trump's exposing it. Chaos on our streets, racial narratives, all that stuff, divisive narratives. Then they wanted to invade Taiwan. That was the 5-year plan for starting a war, a world war from the Chinese Communist Party. The source of that is, again, Jin Canrong, one of the main advisors to Xi Jinping. Leaked documents on it's a very big issue. I've talked about it before. Lula was one of the key figures in that. He was one of the key figures in that. And why does that matter right now? It's because the Trump administration is going after the key pillars of communist influence in Latin America. They've gone after the Castros, the Castro family. The one remaining key figure there is now facing some real issues. Cuban intelligence networks are being kind of disintegrated right now. Maduro got a one-way flight to New York City to face trial. Venezuela is changing. In terms of power structures of the far left in Latin America, you only have a few remaining power structures. Most of the region is shifting conservative. We all know about El Salvador with Bukele. That's where they have these MS-13 prisons and very strong anti-crime efforts. We know about Javier Milei in Argentina, big libertarian shift. There's actually a lot more. Ecuador has gone conservative. You talk about a lot of countries like, Chile, longtime conservative. You can talk about, for example, Colombia just elected a very conservative government, and they're now talking about pushing out CCP influence and everything else. They've gone full-on conservative. The region is changing. One of the few holdouts, Nicaragua, the president there just declared that he's not going to have elections anymore. He's going to be dictator for life, and the U.S. already stepped in to stop that. The one remaining key circle of power is Lula in Brazil. Lula in Brazil. And briefly on that too, even Cuba is facing pressure because the State Department has put out this huge paper alleging that Cuban intelligence networks have been carrying out global operations to effectively invade, start color revolutions, infiltrate the United States, alter politics throughout Latin America, the whole 9 yards. Lula is the one kind of key figure still remaining on the very, very, very far left, who's kind of, holding the line on, far left policies. And he's one of the architects who worked with Cuba on some of these key systems that pushed out the United States and brought in China, Russia, and Iran. What's going to happen in Brazil? We shall see. They're probably going to go through with their election. There's been a lot of talk about this, but I think their ability for funny business is going to be very, very, very slight because you have a lot of external pressure right now. It's going to be very hard for Brazil to pull any funny business with this election. And so I think with that being the case, the threat of U.S. intervention, the threat of the U.S. pushing out any kind of foreign, outside the Monroe Doctrine, you could say America's foreign, but guess what? This is our land because we got the Monroe Doctrine. The ability to push out China, Russia, Iran, and those foreign influences is going to make it very hard for them to do anything. And the additional pressure on Cuba is going to be very important. And a lot of people say, well, what does Cuba have to do with Brazil? The simple answer is a lot. Cuban intelligence networks have been accused of infiltrating the militaries and leadership of many Latin American countries. Talk to key conservative influencers in Brazil, Venezuela, they'll say that their military, a lot of the key leaders are Cubans. And the allegation is basically that Cuba has found a way to puppeteer different governments. The State Department focus on this comes from Marco Rubio says as much. And so there's a lot of changes taking place and a lot more than anybody is talking about right now. We'll see. I want to do more coverage on this because frankly, there are not a lot of U.S. journalists who know the details on these things. I have a lot of good contacts and friends throughout Latin America, and so I can get some really interesting facts. But a lot is happening in Latin America. And a shift in Brazil would be kind of a pivotal moment for the entire region because Brazil is like the economic powerhouse. Brazil is the economic powerhouse. And if they change, the whole region changes. This is going to be a big battle. We'll see where it goes, but that's what's happening right now. Now, on that note, also, even within Latin America, you're seeing pressure. Javier Milei in Argentina, the guy with the chainsaw who says we're going to cut away, government fat. And on his campaign trail had the names of bureaucratic organizations. And he's saying, I'm going to get rid of this and this and this. We're just going to take everything away. And basically created a model of getting the country out of debt and everything. Mixed effects, but actually they have done a pretty good job on it, I would say. He came out and he's accusing the government of Brazil of being quote unquote thieving socialists, which has enraged the Brazilian leadership. And many media are saying enraging Brazil, but it's an important note to say the difference between enraging a bunch of NGOs and left-wing organizations and the government versus the Brazilian people, because I know a lot of Brazilian people would say the same thing, frankly. Interesting note, meaning internal pressure within Latin America, external pressure from the United States, the inability of, let's say, some of the proxy forces, Cuba, China, Russia, Iran, not as able to have an influence. Brazil might flip back. And you're going to watch something very interesting unfold if that happens. Be covering it. I'll be telling you what's happening as things move forward. Also, another note, speaking of elections, Trump has been trying to strengthen election laws right here in the United States. And frankly, he's not having a very easy time with it. One of the key measures he had just got blocked, at least for the midterms. Newsmax says this: a federal appeals court on Saturday declined to allow President Trump's administration to implement in 23 states his executive order that aims to tighten rules for mail-in voting ahead of November elections that will decide control of Congress. It says the Boston-based First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the administration's request to lift an injunction several Democrat-led states secured on June 25 from a lower court judge who concluded that key parts of the Republican president's order were unconstitutional. How dare you try to say we can't have universal mail-in ballots? How dare you say that we might need to ask people who they are when they vote in our elections? How dare you say that we can't clean our voter rolls and have 400,000 dead people and 250,000 illegal aliens in 4 states alone on our voter rolls, and we can't send out ballots to every one of them and have universal mail-in ballots so they can send them in without verifying who they are. How dare you try to undermine our elections, Trump, by doing exactly that? It says this, okay? And asking the court to pause U.S. District Judge Indria Talwani's ruling while it pursues an appeal. The Department of Justice had argued that because government agencies had yet to finalize actions and policies to implement Trump's directive, any lawsuit challenging his order was premature. And it's the appeals court in a 2-1 ruling rejected that argument, meaning the Trump, look, I don't always cover the back and forth for a simple reason. It changes a lot, okay? You're gonna have, the bitter butter battle, Dr. Seuss reference, going back and forth on these things until it hits the Supreme Court. And I'm not the kind of journalist to kind of give you second to second updates like a sportscaster on which court is striking things down and allowing them through. But I will talk about major developments. The Trump admin, the Trump side, they're already trying to advance it to a higher court. It's going to keep moving. But at the current stage, look, really the campaigning for the midterms is really going to take off in September. We're getting pretty dang close. And so unless the Trump admin can really fast track this, it's going to be too late, okay? We will see if they do that. We'll see how it goes. But there are certain laws that require election laws, kind of, the rules of the game to be kind of set before you play it. The rules need to be in place at a certain threshold of time. It's getting pretty dang close to that. So it's going to be very hard for the Trump side to change this in time for the election rules to be set for the midterms. Now, that being said, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of investigation going on when it comes to, for example, left-wing organizations paying homeless people to register to vote or to claim they are somebody they're not. A lot of this was exposed in Los Angeles on Skid Row. Many investigative journalists, James O'Keefe did some fantastic reporting on this, but a lot of others did follow-up reporting too and verified it. Homeless people getting paid to vote, homeless people getting paid by, canvassers and left-wing organizations to claim that they were somebody they were not, to use somebody else's name to vote. They even did the follow-ups where they went to the home addresses of people whose identities they were stealing and talked to them, so they verified this was taking place. Not a lot's happened on that front. A little has. You got one person charged for paying people, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the broader allegations. You have investigations on that front. You have a lot more focus, a lot more pressure on these kinds of things taking place across the country. Many of the fraud networks in terms of stealing money are also being dismantled. And as you look at these organizations, a lot of times, okay, this is kind of the underworld order of criminality. There's overlap oftentimes with criminals. If you have a criminal group committing crimes on one side, typically they're involved in multiple crimes. And one of the benefits from a devious perspective of having people who commit crimes is you have people willing to harm others in order to benefit themselves, and you have people who are willing to violate the law. And so many times when you want to do things nefarious, you'll go to those people to do it. That's just how the economic underworld economy works. And so as they root out these things, as there's focus on it, as people are being thrown in prison or fraud networks are being disrupted, I think the ability for broader fraud to take place is more difficult. Previous reporting, including from Dinesh D'Souza, I know he was discredited some. I do not believe it by any means completely. Some of his reporting still stands very strongly. He alleged that there were like Latin gangs that were involved in some of the ballot harvesting. We'll see what happens with this. We'll see what happens with this. James Dyson in the chat, you're saying, why are states allowed to vote for federal offices when they refuse to comply with federal regulations and laws for federal elections? James, I think you should have a talk with your local representatives about that exact note, okay? It's one of those, if those kids could read, they'd be very offended moments. And to your point too, being real, the Trump administration has made that point also, and they're actually using federal money as kind of collateral on some of their negotiations. For example, going to New York and saying, look, half your policies are not even possible without federal money because you guys are not sustainable. You have a lot of states and cities that are effectively like welfare states that live off the money of other states within the federal system. You have a lot of states that don't pool their own weight, and they get federal money that props up most of their free handout programs. Now you could argue a lot of that comes from the good old debt circle. We're overspending far beyond our means, and we're playing with monopoly money. We have Federal Reserve bank notes that they say represents a certain value, and they just print more of them, which undermines and devalues it even further. And they use this, monopoly money, so to speak, in order to spend beyond their means. So they can double print and double inflation, which they've been doing exponentially, create more money in circulation to do the free handouts, and then bring the country further into debt, which raises interest rates and devalues the dollar. They do that as ways to hand out money too. So there's a bit more to it, right? But anyways, speaking of elections, the cost of living could actually be one of the central issues for voters. And this is kind of coming out now. This is one of the things I think Trump needs to watch out for. And it's one of the things that's kind of at the front of the narrative of the socialists as they're kind of overtaking the Democrat Party. There's a lot going on with this, and I'll kind of give my analysis on what's happening. The socialists won some of their key elections, like in New York and elsewhere, because they were campaigning on cost of living. They weren't saying we're going to come in and destroy the Senate and overthrow half the government and have the president and members of the Supreme Court elected by the House of Representatives, which is the policy right now. We're not going to come in and push like the worst policies that made Biden lose the 2024 election before he backed out and Kamala took over. They're not saying we're going to bring back all the policies that were controversial, like gender changes and far left craziness. They were saying we're going to lower your rent, and we're going to give you discounts on food, and we're going to make the buses free, and everybody gets a free unicorn. They were saying stuff like that, free unicorns and pony rides, and you'll never have to pay for food again, and free houses for everybody, and bees, right? The bees, things like that, right? Everybody gets one. They don't do it. Doesn't work. But, they can promise it, right? They were promising free stuff. The good old commie mamdami model, which made them, win, right? That's how they won it. They're kind of rolling that back now, and they're showing their true colors. And they're saying, no, actually, we want to bring back every crazy far left policy. We want to literally get rid of the Senate. We want to expand the House of Representatives, win local elections, and then have us in the House of Representatives appoint the President of the United States and the Supreme Court. That's what they're saying now. It's a kind of a mask-off moment. So they're abandoning the narrative that I believe actually made them win these local elections. That being said, though, Republicans need to watch out too, because they're frankly not doing so well on cost of living either. Just being real, okay? Cost of living is kind of rough right now. And I'm saying this to not be hypocritical, because look, when Biden was president and, it was going into the 2024 elections, and I was saying You know, a lot of other media were saying the economy is great. Look at the NASDAQ. Look at how great the stock market is doing. It's doing great. I came on here and I made the point that the stock market does not reflect the actual experience of most Americans when it comes to cost of living. Not at all. You can have the stock market's doing great. You can have Nvidia doing a good old vertical shift, right? You can have the NASDAQ doing fantastic, but your average middle American can be having a horrible time. They could be dealing with high cost of living, high rent, inflation, cost of food going up, gas prices through the roof, and that's not going to be reflected in the stock market. And I was saying when Biden was president, the experience of the average American is not good right now, and he's going to lose if they don't shift the narrative to the economy. The Republicans risk the same thing right now. They really do. Let me show you this. Newsmax says a majority of Americans say the cost of living is the worst they can remember, and rising gas prices continue to weigh heavily on voters' views of the economy, according to a new national Politico poll. It says the survey of 2,061 registered voters found that 57% said the cost of living is the worst they have ever experienced, while 26% say it is bad, but that they can remember worse times. It's bad, but I remember it being worse. It's like that meme of the dog sitting in the room on fire. This is great. It says just 8% describe the cost of living as not bad. Those 8% are probably doing pretty well financially. Maybe they're invested in the NASDAQ. And notes the poll also found that higher gas prices are influencing voters politically. If you have to pay a lot of money to drive to work, it's probably not having a good time. It says among those who said gas prices have affected how they plan to vote in November, 46% said they are doubling down on supporting the party they already plan to back, which means, roughly half of voters are not going to change the way they vote. They say, well, 31% say they are more likely to vote for the opposing party, and about 15% were undecided. It adds, respondents were divided over who bears responsibility for the state of the U.S. economy, although President Trump received the largest share of blame. Nearly 32% said Trump holds full responsibility. 17% said former President Joe Biden bears full responsibility. Another 14% said responsibility is shared equally between the two presidents, and about 11% said responsibility rests mainly on Trump, but also with Biden, while 10% Biden is mainly responsible, with some responsibility falling on Trump. My personal take on it, 36% saying Trump is to blame for it all. That's not enough of a factor to really raise too many alarms for the Republicans. 36% might be like your Democrats and your socialists. Like that is not as concerning as it's made out to be, although I do think Republicans need to really get their head in the game on the economy side and affordability, because I think that's what made Biden lose the election. I really do. The economy is the real big issue. Now, on Trump's side, I know he's grappling with the war in Iran and everything else and high cost of gas, mainly because of that and because there's a global kind of price set for oil. And the Biden ad kind of drained all of our oil reserves and didn't replace them, meaning the ability of Trump to kind of play the Biden game and say, release the Kraken, so to speak, release the oil reserves to lower prices artificially so people can pretend that gas doesn't cost that much. Our ability to do that is not really in place. And the systems to replace the global problems for oil using American-made oil and our newly obtained Venezuelan oil. How did we get that? Another story entirely. To use the Venezuelan oil, which we've rightfully taken what really belonged to us, apparently, is not quite running full steam right now. So I believe that long term, this will not be an issue. Long term, the U.S. is probably going to take over security of the Strait of Hormuz. Long term, you're going to find other ways to get oil. Long term, American oil production is going to replace a lot of the need for this, but not in time for the midterms. And so if they're going to really deal with the midterms, I've come to realize most people who vote don't care that much. You know, we're talking in an echo chamber. I'm a journalist, hyper-focused on the news. Anybody watching is probably pretty interested in the news. We're not the majority here. I think the average experience for most people is what really means the most. It really does. You have a lot of people who don't even read the news. They just read sports news and entertainment and everything else. There's plenty of people like that. And direct experience of, hey, groceries cost a lot of money. My bottom line is affected. I'm going to vote for the guy. This guy says he's going to give me a free pony. I want a pony. I want a free house. I want to not pay for the bus. They're going to vote for that guy. So you need to really pay attention to the baseline, because for most people, that is what matters. In the chat, Sandy Sefkic says, so how are voters any different than politicians? All follow the money. We need to hold the line and vote on our freedoms and values. I very much agree. I very much agree. It's a hard reality that a lot of people will vote for personal interest, including short-term interest. And so there are a lot of people who will vote because, you know, you say you're going to give them a bunch of free stuff, and you might never give it to them, but if you tell them free houses and rent control and free discount, you know, free food and free buses, and, you know, I'm going to give all of you a job, or make the people with jobs pay for everything you have. And there are people who are going to vote for it. Now, the question is that enough? I don't know. Frankly, I don't know. The New York model is important on this because the socialists having victories is partly tied in with that. The kind of nuance to that is about 60% of Mamdani's voters were migrants or second-generation immigrants. I mean, you know, New York is not your normal voting base for most of the country. And so you have people of different cultures voting in our election, and a lot of them are voting based on the policies of the countries they came from. They're voting for like communist policies. And so you have a lot of that. And so New York might not be the example the rest of the country follows. Now, like also on the topic of cost of living, though, some of those high costs have to do with things like just bad trade deals, foreign fines, other issues that are making America have financial trouble because we're being robbed by just about every country on the face of the planet. And Trump is now accusing European leaders of using fines. We're going to fine you and tax your feet and tax the street as a way to rob the United States. Trump said this in Truth Social. He said, quote, "The European Union is at it again, as usual, taking direct aim at great American companies. After having fined Apple for no reason at all, $15 billion, Meta, $3 billion, Amazon, $2.5 billion, and many others, we have just been informed that Google, a truly advanced and amazing group, has been fined yet another $1 billion without explanation. It says this brings the Google total to over $18 billion. This illegal and highly discriminatory practice started at these high levels during the first year of Sleepy Joe Biden's administration, Trump says. But it's not going to continue during the Trump administration. The United States of America is not a piggy bank for Europe, nor will we allow it to be. He says, please let this truth serve to represent that we will immediately initiate a 301 investigation into the practice of robbing American companies and, in turn, the American taxpayer. He says the European Union will pay a very big price for this illegal and highly unethical conduct, which I have consistently warned them about. He says the penalties will be entirely reversed, and we anticipate a substantial tariff will be placed on them at the earliest possible moment. Stay tuned, President Donald J. Trump. Now, there's a bit more to this, okay? On the European side, they're basically, what they do is they create different regulations and different laws, like, for example, laws on data sharing, laws on data collection, laws on privacy, laws on protecting minors, laws on censorship and speech and everything else. And when you have American tech companies that collect data and abide by American law, and you're dealing with a globalist internet, European leaders are saying, well, the globalist internet does not follow our laws, but our people can access your internet. Therefore, we have the right to fine you and take money from you. So, this has taken place even in countries where American companies have no presence. So an American company can just be existing on the free market, right here, headquarters in America, but because a person can access that on the internet, which is connected in Europe, the Europeans believe they can fine an American company with no presence within their country. Many of them also argue that because of access and because Europeans spend money on the internet and ad revenue and everything else, that all of the revenue related to Europe is up for taxation and fines and everything else. And so they tax effectively or fine American companies even with no presence in their countries based on their laws. Now, the big concern is that that could be replicated elsewhere. It's a big deal by itself. But if Europe can justify it under the auspices of international law or European law or domestic law, who's to say that India can't do it? Who's to say China can't do it? Who's to say Brazil can't do it? Already we see these countries enacting censorship policies and threatening fines in American companies, even with no presence in their countries as well. And so there's a big threat against American companies based on international law. Briefly on this, I've talked a lot about this on the Josh Phillips show. I've done some great episodes on it. I highly recommend you watch it, which is also on YouTube, by the way. It's my other show, the Josh Phillips show. But back to this point. There's a huge pressure right now taking place of international law, even when it comes to the International Criminal Court and everything else, undermining the basic sovereignty of the United States, American companies, and the American people. Should laws be globalist? Should your ability to be policed on your speech be held not to American law, but to the lowest common denominator internationally? If a single country says, talking about the color blue is illegal, should every country on earth and the citizenry of every country on earth then have to abide by that law? That's where we're going if the global internet and every company operating on the internet can be policed by the lowest common denominator. The country with the most totalitarian laws will set the baseline of laws everywhere. That's the risk we face. The other side of it, and I know this because I've been a journalist for 20 years and I've been following this for a long time. I actually used to be the tech section editor of the Epoch Times for a long time, and I covered cybersecurity. So I've been very kind of knee deep in this kind of news for a long time. I was on a lot of beats. I've been national security, everything. But when it came to this, basically the Europeans have argued, as does China, as do other countries, that America effectively has a monopoly on the internet. We built the internet. It started with ARPANET. It started actually with naval programs. In fact, the deep web was also part of the original kind of naval system, and it's actually maintained through it. The American military built the internet, frankly. And most companies that effectively are the backbone or the foundation of the internet are American companies. Even international rules on the internet, which is through domain name policies, but also through kind of tiered organizations that actually establish the rules of that, used to be government run. Obama handed that off. Actually, Obama, thanks Obama. Obama gave that away. But for the most part, the rules and the domain name systems used to be operated by America as well. And when they were operated by the federal government, that meant that, federal law, it meant that the internet was also protected by the Constitution. So freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of belief was kind of the prevailing nature of the internet. The handing off of this to globalist elites meant that that's no longer the case. The globalization of the internet, including by handing it off to globalist institutions, undermined who gets to say what the rules are effectively, right? That's basically what's happening with the internet. And so many European leaders arguing that America has an unfair monopoly on the internet believed that in order to have high-tech modern economies, that they need to effectively tax or create anti-competitive policies to allow their companies to compete artificially with ours. That's kind of what they're doing. Let me be blunt. That is what they're doing, because there have been direct quotes on this going back many years. And so Trump now is saying, we're not going to play these games. If you want to tax us, we'll tax you right back. Tariffs are kind of a tax on products. If you're going to fine us, we can fine you right back for violating our laws. If you want to create laws, we can do that too. We'll see if he does it. We'll see if he does it. He is saying he's going to do it. Will he do it? Well, we'll have to watch and see. But this is kind of where a lot of the battle is. Americans are also finding out that we've been kind of paying the bills for a lot of Europe too. The fines coming out of Europe in some countries, like Ireland, for example, their fines on American companies are basically enough to fund their own governments. That's how much they're taking from Americans. We're basically propping up the governments of Europe, right? We're propping up a lot of their policies. In addition to that, Americans have been shouldering the cost of low-cost medications in Europe. I've talked about this on the Josh Phillips Show too, how they've kind of manipulated price markets for pharmaceuticals to give artificially low prices for their countries while making us pay the bill, frankly. If you wonder why cost of medicine is so expensive in the US, it's partly because of this. It's part of the reason. I did a whole episode of the Josh Phillips Show about that as well. And we've also been paying for their defense. We've been paying their defense budgets, all of which is kind of changing now. But this is going to be a very slow process. And I should note too, we've been letting them tariff us and fine us and block our companies from selling products there, while allowing free trade of their products here. So there's a lot of trade blockades, and Europe effectively has been living off welfare, and they're the welfare babies of the United States because of these policies. And America is now saying it's time to grow up, time to get some jobs, time to quit living off us, and we're not going to let you play these games anymore. The hard reality is it's not just Europe, it's actually a lot of the world doing this, and it's kind of changing now. And we'll see if Trump does it, but this is effectively what he's saying. In the chat, Wilma Eden is saying, well, if the EU, the European Union, can do that, why can't the US do the same back? I think that's partly what Trump is saying. I think the hard part with this is that if we... Look, the patriotic, screaming eagle American side of me with, the T-shirt of George Washington riding a tank with 2 machine guns loves the idea. I love it. I think we're a disgrace to the nature of empires. We're a conquering empire. We've conquered the world. We've realized the dream. We've realized the dream of Caesar and all the great conquerors of the past. And basically, rather than act like an empire, we just give all the vassal states money and let them rob us. We're a weird empire. We're an empire, but we're a weird empire. We give everybody money. We conquer them and then we pay them money. I don't know why we do it. The problem isn't, I'm partly joking here, but the problem is it doesn't address the basic issue. Like, we could say, well, you're going to fine us. We're just going to fine you right back. We're gonna do tit for tat, and we're gonna say eye for an eye. And if you want to fine our companies, well, we're gonna create some random law, and we're gonna fine all of your companies, and basically let you feel the heat. We're gonna fine you on par with what you charge us or more. And all your European companies are gonna have to pay massive fines that, frankly, their economies probably could not withstand, because the amount of money they're fining American companies is just exponential. We could collapse the economies of Europe if we enacted like compensation. That is how big of a deal that would be. Part of me would love that. Again, the big old patriotic American side of me would love to see that happen. But the more rational side of me says probably not, and here's why. It wouldn't resolve the core issue. I think what really defines America is not financial interest and not, being the conquering country. The reason America is such a unique countries because, post World War II, we became the global leader. I half jokingly talked about, the dream of all these old leaders of like conquering the world. We kind of were handed that. And the American people, the reason we don't use it for ill intent is because most of us don't even want it. Like we don't, you know. We were kind of thrust in that position because we were the most powerful economy, and the American world order basically became what we represent, which is God-given rights, freedom of the individual, free market capitalism, and you do you, bro. That kind of mentality. Like that is kind of what we are as a people. Rather than take money from the countries that lost the wars to us, we turned around and let them tariff us and let them charge us money, and we built their economies. Look at Japan and look at Germany, West Germany, and then later all of Germany. We built their economies. We built Taiwan, we built South Korea, we built a lot of the key economies. Nobody talks about it, but even Iraq is doing pretty dang good. You notice you hardly hear anything from Iraq? That's because the problems aren't so severe there. Afghanistan's another story, but for the most part, if you want to make a lot of money, lose a war to America. So one of the best ways to get rich is to lose a war to America. And there are not a lot of countries in history that have ever done anything like that. Like we're a weird empire, frankly. But the reason is because we don't want welfare states. We don't want to like control you. We want you to be free. And that's basically what we represent. And so fighting international tyranny by creating additional laws, regulations, taxes, and the whole nine yards would be against the core values of what we stand for as a country, in my personal opinion. What should be done is to block them from doing this in the first place. To make it clear that national sovereignty, international law, the protection of the free market should not allow foreign countries to establish rules that undermine the basic freedoms of the individual or to undermine the basic functionings of a free market system, which is what Europe is doing. We should stop them from doing it if we want to defend what America should represent, in my personal opinion. That being said, do you agree with me, disagree with me? Should we tax them into the earth? Tell me in the chat. And until then, thank you so much for being here. Please don't forget to like and share this video. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.